and welcome to Hope Community Church and our Sunday morning service. We hope you enjoy your time with us.
Joseph. I bet you've heard of Joseph. Made famous by the Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat through Lloyd Webber. And it's something of an emotional story, isn't it? And I want us just to enter into a bit of that story. And I think one of the key aspects of the life of Joseph is it is about walking in faith and victory. And what does it really mean in our lives today to walk in faith and victory? You may be familiar with that song from the 80s or the 90s. Be bold, be strong, for the Lord our God is with you. And it says, walk in faith and victory. Let's walk in faith and victory. That's what the Lord has called us to do. He's called us to a life of faith. And Hebrews, in the writer of the Hebrews, refers to Joseph about being a man of faith. And the reason why he's recorded in the scriptures is that we might learn what it means to live in that life of faith and victory. And I have to say, as I read this, even as I read this story this last week, and I know it quite well over the years, there are tears come to my eyes with it. It's a very emotional, heart-wrenching, grabbing story. Maybe I'm just that sort of type. I remember as a child, I don't know, let's say 10 or 11, something like that, and on a Sunday afternoon in my family, we'd have what we call Sunday activities, and we'd read a kind of Christian book. And I remember reading, well, my parents reading to us Treasures of the Snow. I don't know if you know it, book by Patricia St. John. And as we read it, I can remember my tears just coming to my eyes. And it's a story very similar to the story of Joseph, in as much as there's a breakdown of relationship because of somebody doing something nasty to another, and then it comes through to that point of forgiveness and reconciliation. And there's something incredibly emotional about forgiveness, and incredibly exciting about forgiveness. And actually, as I look at the gospel of, I mean, different things have different commodities associated with them, don't they? If you think of an electrician, then their commodity is copper. If you think of a builder, their commodity is bricks and mortar. But actually, as Christians, our core commodity is forgiveness. Whether it's forgiveness from Jesus Christ for all our sin and cleansing, or it's us forgiving others, or us receiving forgiveness together. A core commodity in the church is forgiveness of one another as we live with one another and rub each other up the wrong way sometimes. And so I want to identify this. This is what it actually means to live in life, in faith and victory. First of all, Joseph took God's promise literally. He took God's promise literally. He took hold of it for his life. And we'll look at that a bit more in a moment. Secondly, he was ready to persevere whatever happened. He was ready to push forward, to persevere, to keep going in the Lord's will, whatever happened to him, against all the odds. Thirdly, he was ready to live in purity, even when everything was pushing for him not to. Thirdly, he perceived God's hand in everything that went on. As he looked at it, he saw for God's perspective in it. And so what that all meant, that he was able to practice forgiveness in his daily life with those around him, practicing forgiveness. I want to first of all look at this matter of perseverance and purity, and I'm going to do it by just recounting some of Joseph's life to you. As is the classic testimony at a baptism, I was born at an early age, but while he was born at an early age, he was born at an elderly age for his father. Jacob was 91, he was born to Rachel, her firstborn son, but he was the youngest at that time of 11 siblings. He was at Laban's household that he was born, his uncle's house, and Jacob had been there for 14 years to earn his wives in the way he worked, and now he was working for prosperity, if you like, as he earned sheep and goats. At the age of 6, Joseph left that home, and they headed away from Uncle Laban, all of a sudden, emergency leaving, fleeing away from it because of a breakdown in relationship between Jacob and Laban. And they headed towards Uncle Esau, the old enemy of Jacob, but there was some reconciliation there as they met together. And they went to live in a place called Shechem in Canaan. And it's there, as they are in Canaan, that, if you go to the next slide, John, that Joseph has his first experience with God. You see, one of the things I identified last week about the life of Jacob was that Jacob was called by God to go to Bethel for the second time. It was a place where he'd met him before. But Jacob didn't just go on his own. He took his whole family. And it's wonderful to see families with us this morning as we come together as families to worship God. And that's what Jacob did with his family. But it was there at Bethel that God restated the promise to Jacob of a future land, future blessing, a future people. And I'm pretty sure his family stood there, they heard too God's statement of blessing. So there at the age of 6, Joseph was receiving something from God of his promise and his desire. But also about that time, maybe he was aged about 8, something like that, was his first tragedy in life. As his brother was being born, Benjamin, Rachel, his mum, died. He lost his mother in his early years. But then the scriptures skip forward a number of years to when he's aged about 17. And we read that he was favoured by his father, and his father gives him what Lloyd Webber calls his technicolor coat, his ornamental coat. It was something which was special, some special coat indicating favour to him. And he was very much favoured by his father. But there, as age 17, he has further experience of God, as God reveals to him things through dreams. God comes, brings him dreams of some sheaves, and he says the sheaves belonging to his brothers, the sheaves of corn, they bowed down to his own sheaves. And then he has this other dream about sun, moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. And as he communicates this to his family, what we read is his brothers become more and more at enmity with him. They start to hate him more and more. The Bible says they hated him even more, twice. Because these dreams were showing that one day he was going to have authority over them. Him as the youngest of the brothers, or one of the youngest, was going to have authority over them and they were going to worship. And they couldn't believe it and they couldn't stand it. And so that leads through to the next tragedy, which is this, that he's sold as a slave into slavery. Jacob sends him on an errand about 50 miles away from where he was living to find his brothers. They were sorting out, leading the sheep there, the flocks, about 50 miles away. So quite a long trek over a couple, 2 or 3 days. There the brothers weren't even there. And there someone tells him to go on even further, another 10 miles further on. And he goes and finds the brothers. And the brothers scheme and they say, let's get rid of this. We hate this brother of ours so much, we're going to get rid of him. And so they sell him as a slave to go down to Egypt. And so in his late teens, early 20s, Joseph finds himself in slavery in the house of a guy called Potiphar, who's the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the Egyptian. But there, in Pharaoh's household, again I believe Joseph experiences God as God blesses him and blesses the work of his hands. I'm quite sure as he saw what God was doing through him and how well he was able to do his work, he saw God at work in that way. God was very much with him. And not only did Joseph notice it, but it was seen by those around him too. And it's in that context that we find Joseph's first major victory in life. And his victory went like this. Potiphar's wife, she tempted Joseph. She said to Joseph, come to bed with me. Now that would have been quite an attractive proposition. I don't know what she was like in person or in looks, but it would have been quite flattering to have been asked to go to sleep with someone who was some levels higher than he was. And so she used flattery to try and persuade him. She then used repeated requests as day after day, trying to wear him down and get him to give in. She was opportunistic as she saw occasions when they'd be on their own and she tried to grab him. And then there was this determination as she finally grabbed his cloak, to try to take him to fall to this temptation. But in these occasions we find Joseph in victory rebutting this temptation as he uses words first of all, and he says, I've been trusted with so much. Why should I go against that trust of my master in sleeping with you? He sees that this very thing is off the limits of what's allowed. But not only does he refer it in that way, also he speaks in terms of what sin actually is. He says that is a wicked thing, and that is against God. How vital it is that we, in seeking to rebut temptations in our lives, speak sin as it really is, as wickedness and against God. Joseph was determined above everything else to follow God and his way. And that determination meant that he was not going to fall for this temptation. No. And in fact, he acts on it as well. Not only does he speak against it, but he acts against it as he seeks to avoid the opportunities where he might fall in. He seeks to make sure he's not alone with this woman. And then finally, as she grabs his cloak, he flees from her. Joseph seeks to preserve his honour before God. Honouring God, fulfilling his will, is greater than any pleasure in this world. And so we see, you put up the next point, John, victory. Oh, okay. It's an old version of the PowerPoint. Never mind, don't worry about it. Okay. Don't worry about it, John. It's victory. Okay, it should have been victory coming up. So then thirdly, despite this key victory in his life, key spiritual victory, he enters his third tragedy. The result of his purity, the result of him doing what was right, was a false accusation which led to him being put into prison, in jail. But there we read again, the Lord was with him and gave him favour and success. So he was quickly made to look after the other prisoners and given responsibility there. And there in that prison, on a particular day after some years, Pharaoh sends down to the prison, because they've fallen out of favour with him, his cupbearer, who's kind of his number one man really, because he's testing the wine before he tastes it to make sure it's not poisoned, and his baker, who prepared his bread for him. He sends them down. And while they're there, God gives them dreams. And again, Jacob experiences God as he says to them, God can interpret dreams. And God gives him an interpretation for their dreams. And as he gives them this interpretation, we find in the next few days that they are fulfilled. Joseph's dream interpretation is indeed from God, and it happens exactly as he said. Another experience of God working through him. But that just enters the next tragedy, because he says to the cupbearer, who he said would be reappointed, the baker he said would be hanged, the cupbearer says, remember me when you're back with Pharaoh. Speak well of me to him. But we read those sad words, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. So Joseph is stuck there, forgotten, an imprisoned slave, separated and sent away by his own family. What could be worse? Forgotten, enslaved, imprisoned, and rejected by your own family. But God was at work, and Joseph knew that God was at work. The circumstances do not define whether God's at work or not. Your circumstances do not define whether God is at work or not. It's living by faith. Living by faith and victory is what we see in the life of Joseph. But what God is then doing, he's working again, not in the lives of a believer, but he's working once again in the life of an unbeliever, as he sends a dream to Pharaoh. Two dreams, in fact. One about corn and one about cats. You can read about them in the various chapters in Genesis. And he's looking for someone to interpret them. But God is not only at work in the palace with Pharaoh, the unbeliever, he's also working in the prison in the believer Joseph. And he gives him interpretation. And the cupbearer brings to mind, oh, Pharaoh, a couple of years ago, there was this guy in the prison. And he had the gift of God to interpret dreams. Oh, bring him up. So suddenly Joseph is transformed from this enslaved prisoner to being given a fresh set of clothes, being given a nice shower, being given a good cut of his hair, and made to look presentable and brought before Pharaoh. And he says to Pharaoh, but God only can interpret dreams. And as Pharaoh shares the dream, God gives him the interpretation. And it is this, that there is going to be a feasting in the land for 7 years, and then a famine in the land for another 7 years. So again, if you go to the next slide, John, we find that he experiences God again as God reveals the meaning to him. But there's a real sense of victory in this, because Pharaoh, I hope he does come up with victory this time, but it might not. Yes, he comes up with victory, marvellous. Okay, because God is fulfilling his purposes. Now, it might be for you that it's not to be a prime minister of a country. Okay, for Joseph it was. But the truth is even when you're right in the lowest places, actually God is fulfilling his purpose in your life. And ultimately, he is bringing you into a place where you are one with him and you will be with him for eternity. Not for these years alone, not for these few short years. Oh, it must have seemed like a long time that Joseph was in jail. It must have seemed like a long time that he was in slavery. A long time separated from his family. But God was at work and God was bringing about his purposes, and it was for good things. Pharaoh spots, he says, Joseph is one on whom the Spirit of God rests. What a wonderful testimony from an unbeliever. And so he says, you shall be in charge. And over those next couple of years, Joseph then has a wife and family, and things all start to pan out nicely for him. There's one thing outstanding though. That's his relationship with his family, with his brothers and his father. And the remarkable thing is the famine is not only in Egypt, but it's also in Canaan as well. And God causes the brothers to come down to Egypt because they hear there is food in the land. And just imagine what Joseph felt as his brothers came in front of him. Can you imagine the heartstrings that were being pulled within him? Imagine the emotional response. We read that Joseph had to go out of the room and he wept and stuff. But also, he must have seen that God was fulfilling the dreams that he'd been given as a young lad. Once again, he was experiencing God and the fulfillment of dreams. But also we see a real sense of, again, victory in Joseph's life, because Joseph exercises wisdom in how he deals with his brothers, as well as a love and care for them. You can read the story in detail, but he tests them to see where they are really at. But these brothers, they were living in guilt, and we see it in their response. They're living because they know they once, well, they think they probably killed their brother. They don't know exactly what happened to him. They haven't a clue, but they sold him as a slave. And the father is also living in real mourning still, because as far as he's concerned, Joseph was killed. You see, these brothers had told a lie to try and cover it up and take away any responsibility on their part. The family was still in mourning and in guilt. But then eventually they come back a second, they go away with food and they come back a second time. And I want to read this to you. As they come back, and he's done some various things with them to test them again, and he's established that they now care for their father and they care for Benjamin. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Guilt brings fear before their brother. Then Joseph says to his brothers, come close to me. When they'd done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph that you sold into Egypt. And now, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me here ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land. For the next 5 years, there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. Now hurry back to your father and say to him, this is what the son of your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. And he goes on to say, you're to live here and I'm going to provide for you and cared for you and everything else. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. What a wonderful scene. As a family once again is united. But it becomes about this unity because Joseph saw that God's hand was at work even in the evil which was done to him. Even in the evil. I don't know what you feel people have done against you. Maybe recently. Maybe over the years. There's power in forgiveness. Forgiveness is the currency of the gospel. If you are a Christian, if you're a follower of Christ, core to your life is forgiving others. And you can do it because you trust God. In the reading Tony read to us, Joseph says, am I in the place of God? When we seek to judge others rather than forgive them, we are putting ourselves in God's place. When we forgive them, we are allowing God to exercise that judgment. What a beauty. What a beauty to live in the way of God. So the family is reconciled. But we move forward to Jacob's death, and the brothers are still concerned. They come back to him in the story that Tony read because they are concerned that actually Joseph was just putting on a front because his father was there. You see, one of the other hard things to do, it's not only hard to forgive sometimes, it's also hard to receive forgiveness. And Joseph pleads with them, no, I have completely forgiven you. We often want to hold on to that guilt somehow. We somehow want to keep putting ourselves down in that regard. But God, we know, he says to us, you are completely forgiven. If you confess our sins, we are forgiven, and he cleanses us from all unrighteousness. There's no longer anything there. We're now able to enter that place of grace with God. We're able to enter right in boldly, as writer of Hebrews puts it. Don't hold on to your past sin, my friend. Set it aside, because Jesus Christ has removed your sin as far as the east is from the west. Receive his forgiveness. Receive forgiveness from the people around you. Humble ourselves and receive it. It's totally bought by Jesus Christ's death on a cross. So that brings to a conclusion what it means to live in faith and victory. Living in faith and victory is not about huge success in a worldly sense, but it's about persevering in difficulty. It's about retaining purity in temptation. It's about perceiving the big picture of what God is doing. And it's on the basis of all that, practicing forgiveness, both receiving it and giving it, day by day. Who do you need to forgive? Who do you need to receive forgiveness from? May God enable us to truly live in that victory. In Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Thank you, Tony.